Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The wind carried the scent of wet sand and diesel through the streets of Port Harcourt that evening, a reminder that the city was both alive and always working. It had rained earlier, the kind of rain that floods gutters and drowns impatience. So by the time Pearl stepped out of the taxi and entered her apartment gate, the sky was smeared with deep gray clouds and the air hung heavy with the weight of unspoken things. She walked in quietly, her gym bag dragging behind her like it too was tired. The apartment was clean but hollow, swept floors, arranged cushions, cold lights, but no heartbeat. Josh had left for Bonny Island 3 weeks ago, gone to supervise an offshore project that would keep him away for another 40 days. Pearl's life, since their move from Enugu to Port Harcourt, had become a stretch of silences punctuated by video calls and text messages filled with more emojis than meaning. They had been married for 3 years, and she still loved him, but love, on its own, was not a balm for loneliness. She had taken to humming to herself, not because she liked the sound of her voice, but because silence in that apartment had started to feel like a third person watching her. Most days, she worked on her laptop from the dining table, her eyes flickering between design software and the window, as though waiting for something, anything, to change. When Pearl signed up at Muscle Nation Gym, it wasn't with the intention of finding excitement. It was closer to survival. She had tried YouTube home workouts, but there's something about real people and shared space that makes even sweat feel communal. The gym was neatly tucked along Stadium Road, facing an old eatery and a series of boutique shops that never seemed to close. On her first day, she wore a black hoodie and joggers and walked in with the attitude of someone not looking to make friends. But within 10 minutes, she had noticed him, Emeka. He wasn't the loudest trainer in the gym, but he was the one everyone looked at, and he never seemed to look at anyone unless he meant to. Pearl noticed how he moved like he had studied himself in mirrors for years, not in vanity but in understanding. There was precision in every step, confidence that didn't scream. He greeted her that day with a nod, nothing more, and moved on. She exhaled. That should have been the end of it. But the next morning, he was the one who adjusted her stance during squats and gave a half smile when she got it right. It wasn't flirty. Not yet. But it was attention. And sometimes attention from the right person feels like water in a drought. By the 3rd week, she was taking personalized routines with him. It was easier to justify that way. She told herself, he's just a trainer. But even lies sound reasonable when the heart is bored and the nights are long. The city was its own story. Port Harcourt had a pulse that never really rested. There were nights Pearl would hear cars racing down the express by 2 a.m., loud laughter from the compound next door, the hum of generators that sang like night birds. The city was restless and made her restless too. It was during one of those nights, unable to sleep and too stubborn to call Josh again, that she opened her phone and found herself scrolling through Emeka's Instagram page. The photos were simple, him lifting weights, walking into the gym, posing with clients, but there was something in the way his eyes met the camera that made her linger. She liked 2 posts quickly, like a thief stealing glances. 10 minutes later, a message popped up. "You're up late. Can't sleep?" That was all it took. A crack in the wall. They started talking, small talk at first, gym routines, diet plans, memes. Then came the jokes, the voice notes, the slightly longer replies. Pearl knew where the road led. She could feel it, but there was a danger that felt too familiar to avoid. She didn't see herself as reckless, but boredom is a silent thief. It steals principles in small doses until you're left with only impulse. She didn't block him. She didn't silence the chats. Instead, she found herself smiling at her phone like a schoolgirl, even though her husband's picture still stood on the TV stand beside their wedding frame. Still, Pearl wasn't blind. She saw the way Emeka carried himself. He knew the effect he had on women, and that made him dangerous, not because he flaunted it, but because he didn't have to. There's a kind of man whose silence says more than his words. Emeka was that kind. He didn't ask about her husband. Not directly. But he would drop casual comments like, "You always come alone. Your man no day try small." And each time, she would chuckle nervously, brushing it off, even though part of her wanted to explain. To defend Josh. To defend herself. But excuses felt pointless. She started wearing lip gloss to the gym, not for him. At least, that's what she told herself. Her playlist began to shift too, more upbeat songs, more dancing in front of her mirror, less gospel. She had started walking to the gym instead of driving. Emeka would sometimes watch her from the gate, drinking bottled water, and her pulse would skip. It wasn't love, but it was something. Something that made her question whether she was lonely or just starved of being seen. That was the beginning. Not of a love story, but of a decision that would grow teeth and come back to bite her in the dark. And she didn't even know it yet. The rain had started with soft taps on the roof like a polite knock, but within minutes, it became a full-blown storm, the kind that made you pause and rethink stepping outside. It was a Friday, and the gym had thinned out faster than usual. Most of the clients had dashed out after their sessions, knowing Port Harcourt rain didn't play fair. Pearl had stayed back to finish a routine Emeka said would help with her waistline. She could feel her shirt clinging to her back with sweat, her thighs sore and trembling, but the ache made her feel alive. The sound of iron clanging and the low buzz of the generator were the only company she had, until Emeka walked in, towel slung over his shoulder, sweat glistening on his chest, his scent sharp like a storm warning. Their eyes met briefly. He walked over and handed her a water bottle without saying a word. The silence between them felt like a string pulled too tight. When she told him she wasn't sure how to get home in the downpour, he shrugged and said he could drop her. That was all it took. No dramatic offer. Just calm certainty, the way people offer umbrellas in a storm. She hesitated, but not enough to refuse. They walked out together, her heart thudding like it was trying to climb out of her chest. The rain drenched them as they dashed to his car, a red Corolla parked close to the gate. Inside, the air was thick with heat and something else. Something unnamed, but loud. The drive was quiet at first. Pearl gave him directions, speaking in short, clipped phrases. The streets were slippery, and water pooled in the potholes like tiny oceans. Emeka drove with one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally brushing back his hair. He didn't rush. His car moved like it had nowhere urgent to be, and somehow, that steadiness unnerved her. She kept her eyes on the windshield, pretending not to notice the subtle glances he threw her way. Somewhere along GRA Junction, the silence cracked. He asked her why she looked sad most times she came to the gym. The question caught her off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because no one had asked her that in a long time, not even Josh. She laughed it off, muttering something about being tired. Emeka nodded slowly, like he didn't believe her, but wouldn't push. Then he said something unexpected, something that wrapped itself around her like a scarf in cold air. Some people look whole outside, but they day crack inside. She didn't know why that stuck. Maybe because it was true. Maybe because, for the first time in weeks, someone had seen past her well-put-together face and sensed the chaos beneath. When they got to her gate, she didn't open the door immediately. The rain was still falling. His wipers made that slow, hypnotic swish. She turned to thank him. He smiled slow and knowing and replied, "Anytime." Their eyes held each other for a few seconds longer than was safe. Then she stepped out and ran into the house, heart thumping, pulse singing a song she couldn't name. That night, Pearl sat in the dark living room, her phone resting on her lap like it was waiting for permission. She could hear the generator humming from a nearby compound, could smell the rain-soaked earth through the slightly open window. She thought about Josh, how he used to tickle her just to see her laugh, how he always brought her groundnut and banana from the roadside like it was a bouquet. But lately, even his voice over the phone felt like a voice note from a stranger. She didn't want to admit it, but the emotional distance between them had become a river too wide to swim across. And Emeka? He was present, physical, real, not in a fantasy way, but in the way his eyes stayed on her longer than necessary, in the way his voice lingered when he said her name. When her phone finally lit up with a message, she didn't need to guess who it was. "Hope you reach house well." Her fingers hovered. She replied simply, "I did. Thank you." A minute later, another message. "You get light? Or you day for candle mood?" That made her laugh, and it felt good. That single line held more warmth than the dozen cold, "I miss yous" Josh had sent in recent weeks. She knew it was dangerous. She knew it was the kind of slope people didn't slide down, they tumbled. But part of her was tired of always being the good wife with nothing to show for it, but silence and waiting. And something about Emeka's charm wasn't loud. It was quiet, but it crept in through the cracks like water and stayed. Over the next few days, something began to change, not suddenly, not like a light switch, but like dusk turning to night. Emeka and Pearl didn't cross any physical lines, not yet, but their words began to wear different clothes. There was softness, small jokes about the shape of her hips, the way her cheeks flushed after lifting weights. Pearl would laugh and pretend to frown, but deep down, the attention filled something in her that had long gone dry. The gym became more than a place to sweat, it became an escape. She started staying later, doing extra stretches, lingering by the mirrors while Emeka cleaned up or locked the weights. He would sometimes walk her to her car and lean casually on the door as they talked about nothing. The price of fuel, how Nipa had no mercy, the annoying new playlist the gym manager insisted on playing. She noticed how he rarely talked about himself, how his eyes always seemed to be thinking one thing while his mouth said another. She found herself wanting to know more about him, not just his routines or gym advice, but what made him tick, what made him smile, what made him angry. She started wearing slightly more fitted leggings. Not for attention, she told herself, just for confidence. But even she didn't believe that lie anymore. What started as friendly turned to flirting. What felt like harmless banter began to carry undercurrents too strong to ignore. And although no one had touched anyone, the line between right and wrong was already blurry, fading faster than she was willing to admit. It was a Saturday morning when Pearl felt the first twinge of discomfort, not in her body, but somewhere deeper, like her spirit was trying to send her a message she didn't have the courage to read. She had just finished her home Pilates session, her yoga mat still warm beneath her, sweat glistening on her collarbone, but her mind was miles away. Her phone had buzzed again, Emeka, asking if she was coming to the gym later. His messages had grown shorter, more casual, almost routine, and for some reason, that unnerved her more than the flirtation. There was something about the ease in which they now communicated that made it feel like an arrangement, like a secret rhythm no one else could hear. She tossed the phone aside and stood up to shower, but her reflection in the mirror made her pause. There was a new fullness in her face, a tenderness in her chest she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to raise questions she wasn't ready to answer. She stepped into the shower and let the water run longer than necessary, as if rinsing her body would wash off the guilt that clung to her thoughts. When she emerged, she didn't go to the gym. Instead, she crawled into bed, pulled the sheets over her head, and tried to sleep. But rest wouldn't come. Her body was trying to whisper a truth her mind was too afraid to hear. By evening, she had convinced herself it was stress. The city was too hot, her routine too scattered, her emotions too messy. Still, the unease sat heavy in her chest, like smoke with no fire. Days passed, and with each one came a new sign she couldn't ignore. Her appetite shifted. Some days she ate like a soldier home from war, other days, even the smell of fried eggs made her nauseous. She dismissed it as hormonal imbalance, the kind of random chaos women's bodies are known for. But when she missed her period for the second time, her denial could no longer hold water. She went to a small pharmacy tucked between a salon and a betting shop on Ada George Road. She wore a cap low over her face and dark glasses, though no one there knew her name. The pharmacist, a woman with tired eyes and a scarf that looked like it had seen many rainy seasons, slid the test kit into a black nylon bag without saying a word. Pearl drove home in silence. The roads were busy, Port Harcourt never slept, but inside her car, there was a stillness that bordered on dread. She got home, locked the doors, and went straight to the bathroom. Her hands shook as she read the instructions, though she'd seen 1,000 videos online. She waited the required minutes, heart banging like a faulty generator. When the results appeared, it wasn't dramatic. Just 2 lines. Simple. Clear. Life-altering. Her knees buckled. She sat on the floor and stared. Her breath caught in her throat, and suddenly the walls felt too close, the air too thick. She didn't cry. She just sat there, eyes wide, lips trembling, the truth sitting beside her like an unwanted guest. The test didn't lie. Her body didn't lie. Something was growing inside her, and her husband hadn't touched her in over 9 weeks. She called Emeka that night, unsure of what she wanted him to say. Maybe she thought he'd panic or deny, or perhaps offer a solution, but what she heard instead froze her blood. He had picked on the second ring, his voice lazy like he had just woken up or had nothing urgent in the world to worry about. When she told him about the pregnancy, there was a pause, short but heavy. Then he said with a low sigh, "You too?" It took her a second to process it. Her mind twisted around those 2 words, trying to make them mean something else. "What do you mean me too?" she asked, voice shaky. Emeka exhaled again, as if frustrated. "Pearl, look, I didn't plan this. There are other girls. I'm already dealing with drama from 2 others. Don't add your own." The words hit her like a slap across the face. She couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. Her tongue felt too thick, her throat too dry. "Other girls?" she managed to whisper. "How many?" He didn't answer directly. Just muttered something about how he didn't force anyone, how they all knew it was casual, how things just happen. She ended the call without saying goodbye. Her phone slipped from her fingers and landed on the floor. The room swam around her. She felt her stomach twist, not from pregnancy but from shame. She had been just one in a rotation, another name on a list, another body in a schedule. And now, she was carrying the consequences of a moment she couldn't undo, while the man responsible acted like she had asked for it. The days that followed blurred into one another. Pearl stopped going to the gym. She stopped replying to Emika's messages too, though they eventually stopped coming altogether. The silence was both a relief and an insult. She started walking early in the morning, before the city woke, wrapped in oversized clothes, her face hidden beneath scarves. She avoided neighbors. She avoided mirrors. But the bump wasn't staying quiet anymore. It was small but firm. Her body had started to change in ways that mocked her efforts to remain invisible. She knew she couldn't keep the truth buried much longer. Josh was due back in less than a month. How would she explain a belly he didn't help fill? She thought of fleeing, maybe going to Abuja to stay with her cousin for a while, but running felt cowardly, and besides, secrets had legs in Nigeria. They always found a way to follow you. One evening, as she lay on the couch, stomach twisting with indecision, she thought of the other girls Emika had gotten pregnant. She wondered if they, too, sat in dark rooms weighing impossible choices. Were they older? Younger? Were they as confused as she was, or had they already made peace with the chaos? The truth was, she didn't even care about them. Not out of cruelty, but because her own world was collapsing too loudly. She was drowning, and there was no room left in her lungs for sympathy. All she wanted was clarity, something to hold on to, something solid. But all she had was the sound of her own heartbeat, echoing louder than the city outside. Josh's return date hung in the air like the smell of kerosene, unseen, but impossible to ignore. The knowledge that he would be back in less than 2 weeks wrapped itself around Pearl like a noose steadily tightening. She had memorized his offshore schedule, so well that she didn't need reminders anymore. She would wake up every day, stare at the ceiling and count down like a prisoner waiting for Judgment Day. Every passing hour felt like a cruel clock mocking her, daring her to speak the truth she hadn't even admitted to herself out loud. She would rehearse the words in her head. Josh, I made a mistake. Josh, I wasn't myself. Josh, I'm pregnant and it's not what you think. But none of it sounded believable, not even to her. Outside, Port Harcourt remained its chaotic self. The loud horns of tricycles, the steady buzz of Okadas weaving through traffic, the shouting of tomato sellers in the market. Life was moving, noisy and indifferent to the storm brewing inside her. At night, she would sit on the edge of her bed, run her palm gently over her stomach, and listen for something. Not the baby, no, it was too early for kicks, but for strength. For a voice inside her that would say you'll be fine, or even you'll figure it out. But all she heard was silence. Thick, accusing silence that followed her from room to room like a second shadow. Her phone was mostly quiet now. Emika had stopped texting completely, and strangely, that made it worse. She didn't want him, not anymore, not really, but the silence made her feel discarded, as if the mistake she made had no weight to him at all. She was carrying everything, emotionally, physically, while he slept peacefully somewhere, likely charming the next woman into smiling while doing squats. The unease became unbearable the day she ran into Tonia at the pharmacy along Oluwabasanjo Road. Tonia had been a familiar face at the gym, always in tight tracksuits and full lashes, a woman who looked like she had her life held together with invisible strings. Pearl didn't expect to see her, not in a place like that, and certainly not holding a small brown envelope that could only mean one thing. Their eyes locked for a moment too long. Recognition. Tension. Then the subtle nod of understanding between two women carrying similar burdens. Pearl tried to act casual, but her heart was galloping like a horse under pressure. Tonia approached, slowly, as if unsure whether to speak. When she finally did, her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "You too?" she asked. Pearl nodded, unable to say anything. "He told me I was the only one," Tonia added with a dry, bitter chuckle. Pearl wanted to respond, maybe even say something comforting, but no words came. Tonia placed the envelope back in her bag and gave Pearl a small, weary smile. "I don't know about you," she said, "but I'm done keeping quiet." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Pearl standing in the middle of the pharmacy, like a statue someone forgot to move. That brief encounter was more than just a coincidence, it was a mirror. And in that reflection, Pearl saw not just herself, but the web Emika had spun, tight and deliberate. A web built on charm and silence, leaving every woman who got caught in it to claw their way out alone. As Pearl walked back to her car, a strange new emotion began to bloom inside her. Not rage, not shame, but something sharper. Resolve. By the time Josh called to say his boat would dock earlier than planned, she had already made up her mind. There would be no lies, no cover stories. She would tell him everything. She didn't know what would come after that. If he'd leave, if he'd shout, if he'd pack his bags and vanish from her life. But whatever the outcome, it had to start with the truth. She cleaned the house that day like someone expecting guests, not because Josh cared about dust, but because she needed the control. She scrubbed the tiles, aired the curtains, even changed the bedsheets to the ones with the soft blue patterns he liked. But inside, her mind was spinning, dragging her between memory and fear. She remembered their wedding, how he had held her hand like it was something precious. She remembered their first Christmas together, sitting cross-legged on the rug, laughing over burnt jollof rice and cheap wine. She remembered all the times she had chosen to wait for him, through job transfers, late nights, missed anniversaries. And now she would have to tell him that in one moment of weakness, she broke everything they had built. She rehearsed the confession again, this time aloud, pacing the living room like an actor preparing for the hardest scene of her life. Her voice cracked halfway through. She stopped and pressed a pillow to her chest, breathing slowly, counting backwards. 10, 9, 8. The sound of her phone ringing sliced through the silence. It was Josh. "I'll be home tomorrow," he said. "Don't bother coming to pick me. I'll get a cab from the jetty." His voice was tired but warm, the way it always got after long trips. She smiled faintly and said okay. When the call ended, she sat down and wept. Not for him. For herself. For the woman she used to be, and the one she was about to become. The next morning came too fast, sunlight creeping in through the blinds like a warning. Pearl stood by the window, arms folded, watching the compound slowly come to life. The gateman watered the plants with one hand while talking on the phone. A delivery bike parked outside the next flat. Children ran around with balloons left over from a neighbor's birthday party the night before. Everything looked normal. But inside her body, war drums were beating. Josh arrived just after 1 p.m., suitcase in one hand, laptop bag slung across his shoulder, face sunburnt and unshaven. She opened the door slowly, stepping aside to let him in. The hug they shared was brief, awkward. His eyes scanned her face, her posture, her form. He didn't say anything, but she knew he noticed the changes. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, a space between them wide enough to hold the weight of every unspoken thing. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled themselves in her throat. Josh leaned forward and placed his hands on his knees, staring at the floor. "Pearl," he said finally, "are you pregnant?" It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. He didn't react immediately. He just sat there, his expression unreadable, like a man watching his house burn from the inside, too stunned to scream. After what felt like an hour, he stood up and walked into the bedroom without a word. She followed, tears now sliding freely down her cheeks. But still she said nothing. There was no defense. No clever excuse. The truth had arrived like a storm, and now they were both soaking in it, unsure if they would survive the flood. The evening passed without a word between them, but silence often speaks louder than anger, and that day it was deafening. Josh didn't slam any doors, didn't shout or curse. He simply withdrew into himself like a man nursing a wound too deep for bandages. Pearl remained in the living room after he shut the bedroom door behind him, sitting stiffly on the edge of the chair like someone on trial awaiting sentencing. Her palms were sweaty, her lips cracked from the air conditioning, but the coldest part of the room was not the temperature. It was the space between them. She tried to sleep later that night, curled up on the couch, one arm cradling her belly. But sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Josh's expression, void, unreadable, stripped of emotion. It wasn't hatred that scared her. Hatred she could fight. It was the absence of anything at all, like he had already started folding her out of his life. She thought of apologizing again, but what was left to say? The truth had already done the damage. Around 2 a.m., she tiptoed to the bedroom door and found it unlocked. He was lying on his side, eyes closed, one hand under his cheek like a boy lost in thought. She didn't dare enter. She just stood there, watching, remembering all the times she had prayed for him to come home safely, how her phone lit up with his offshore photos and sweet messages. She wondered how something that had once felt so solid could now feel so fragile, like one more word might break it beyond repair. She returned to the couch and sat till sunrise, body aching with regret, soul heavy like soaked laundry. The days that followed blurred into each other like watercolors bleeding on wet paper. Josh went about his routine with the precision of someone on autopilot. Shower at 6, quick breakfast of bread and black tea, keys jingling by 7 as he left for meetings with his offshore partners in town. Pearl moved around him like a shadow, cleaning the kitchen twice a day, even when it wasn't dirty, folding and refolding already neat laundry, trying to make herself useful, visible, forgiven. They barely spoke, and when they did, the words were functional, transactional. "Did you eat? Your laundry's in the room." Nipa brought light. She would catch him sometimes staring at her stomach, his expression softening briefly before hardening again. One morning, she placed a hand on his as he reached for his wallet, hoping to start a conversation, but he pulled away gently, avoiding eye contact. She told herself to be patient, that wounds take time to heal, but deep down she feared that this wasn't a wound. It was a tear, and tears don't always mend. She stopped calling friends, stopped checking her WhatsApp. She turned off her Instagram notifications. Her world shrank to the size of that flat, those four walls, that man who used to be her home, but now felt like a stranger squatting in her memories. The loneliness was louder now than it had ever been before. It was no longer the kind of emptiness you could blame on a quiet house. It was the kind that lives inside your chest, knocking every time you try to breathe. She sometimes whispered to the baby, not to bond, but to remind herself that she hadn't disappeared completely. One Thursday afternoon, when the heat hung thick in the air and even the birds sounded tired, Pearl decided to go for a checkup at the clinic along Peter Adelai Road. It wasn't planned. She just got up, dressed simply in a long gown and slippers, and left without saying anything. The waiting room was cold, the receptionist polite in a mechanical way, and the doctor, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a firm voice, asked all the routine questions. Pearl lay on the examination table, fingers clenched, heart pounding against her ribs. When the scan started, the room fell silent except for the beeping of the machine and the occasional scratch of the doctor's pen against paper. A few minutes in, the doctor paused, frowned slightly, then adjusted the scanner. "You said your last period was 9 weeks before your husband returned?" the doctor asked. Pearl nodded slowly, unsure why the question was repeated. The doctor hummed softly, then turned the screen toward her. "You're measuring at about 28 weeks. That's 7 months, not 5. Pearl blinked. "Sorry?" The doctor repeated it, this time more gently. "You're further along than you think." Pearl's mouth went dry. She sat up too fast, her head spinning. The numbers didn't lie. 28 weeks meant the pregnancy began long before Emeka. Long before the mistake. It started before Josh left for Bonnie. The realization hit her like cold water thrown on bare skin. The baby was his. Josh's. Not Emeka's. Not the gym. Not the shame. Her body trembled with relief, confusion, and something close to gratitude. But the joy didn't come rushing in like she expected. It stayed outside, cautious, like it didn't trust her yet. She drove home slowly, the sun beginning to set behind the clustered rooftops of the city, painting the sky with streaks of gold and charcoal. Cars honked as impatient drivers wove recklessly through traffic, but she barely noticed. Her hands stayed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, her mind heavy with the weight of everything she now carried. Not just the child, but the truth. This truth could fix things, or it could fall flat like a joke told too late. When she got home, Josh was seated at the dining table, reading something on his laptop, his glasses perched low on his nose. She dropped her bag gently and stood beside him, unsure how to begin. He looked up, met her eyes briefly, then returned to his screen. "I went for a scan," she said quietly. He didn't respond. "They said I'm 28 weeks, she added, voice barely above a whisper. His hands paused on the keyboard. Slowly, he looked at her again, this time longer, searching her face like it held a puzzle he hadn't finished solving. "That's before I left," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Pearl nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. He stared at her stomach, then at her again. "Are you sure?" She handed him the printout, hands trembling. He took it, scanned it quickly, and set it down. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then, Josh stood up, walked past her toward the window, and stood there, his back turned. She thought he might cry, or curse, or hold her. But he did none of that. He just stood there, as the fading sun cast long shadows across the room, both of them suspended in a fragile kind of hope neither of them had words for yet. The next morning arrived without drama. There was no sudden burst of reconciliation, no drawn-out apology. The air in the house felt lighter, but it wasn't joy, it was something else. Acceptance, maybe. Pearl woke up before the sun, watched the room fill with soft light as she lay still, not daring to move too quickly in case it disrupted whatever fragile peace was trying to settle between them. Josh was asleep beside her, turned away, his breathing slow and steady. She didn't know what he was thinking, and for once, she didn't try to guess. The truth had been laid bare between them the night before, like a fragile offering placed between two wary people. It hadn't fixed everything, but it had shifted something. She stepped out of bed, tiptoeing through the hallway, her fingers brushing the walls as if grounding herself. She made tea slowly, the way Josh liked it, black, no sugar, one Lipton bag, left to steep until the cup looked like engine oil. She placed it on the dining table beside his laptop, not out of duty, but out of something quieter. A gesture, not a solution. He joined her an hour later, hair still messy from sleep, eyes swollen from nights without proper rest. He took the tea, sipped it, then said thank you, and the way he said it made her chest ache. There was no bitterness in his voice, no sarcasm, just weariness. Not the kind that sleep could cure, but the kind that came from carrying too many things inside for too long. They didn't talk about the baby again that day. They didn't talk about Emeka. What they shared was a silence that didn't feel sharp anymore, just tired. But in that fatigue, there was a small, flickering warmth, like an ember that hadn't died yet. Pearl started writing again, not for clients, but for herself. At first, it was just a few scribbles in an old notepad buried in one of the kitchen drawers. Then pages started to fill. She wrote about confusion, about desire, about mistakes that felt like storms and mornings that felt like clean slates. She didn't show Josh. She didn't even read them twice. It wasn't about healing yet, it was about breathing. Something about letting the words out made the shame sit down for a while. The baby was growing faster now, her body fuller, her pace slower. She began to feel the flutters, little movements like bubbles, subtle reminders that life was happening inside her whether she was ready or not. Josh began asking small questions, practical ones. Do you want to deliver in a private hospital? What's your blood group again? Did your mom have complications? She answered each one carefully, measuring her tone, not wanting to startle whatever softness was returning between them. He no longer recoiled when she stood close. Once, while reaching over her shoulder to grab the car keys, his hand brushed her waist, and neither of them pulled back. It was a small moment, but it settled in her chest like a pebble in water, creating quiet ripples. They weren't okay, not fully, but they weren't breaking apart anymore either. One night, as they watched TV in silence, he placed his hand gently on her belly without looking at her. Her breath caught. The room didn't spin. The world didn't shift. But something inside her settled. That touch was not forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. She let her hand rest over his. For the first time in weeks, they both stayed still. Emeka was never mentioned again, not directly. But he lingered like a cigarette smell that clings long after the smoker has gone. Pearl heard through Linda, a former gym client turned reluctant informant, that Emeka had shut down Muscle Nation without notice. Rumors circled that one of the girls had lost her baby, and that her brother had stormed the gym in a rage, threatening to make him disappear. Some said he fled to Abuja. Others claimed he had gone to Ghana. It didn't matter anymore. He was a chapter that had already closed, a character whose relevance had withered the moment truth took root in her life. Pearl didn't feel hatred, not anymore. She had moved past the anger and landed somewhere quieter. Not forgiveness, but detachment. She no longer checked his Instagram. She deleted his number. There was no confrontation, no dramatic showdown. Just silence. One morning, while sorting through old messages, she stumbled on their first conversation, his harmless "can't sleep" text, and she stared at it like it belonged to someone else. A different woman. One who was searching for something outside herself. She didn't reply to it. She simply deleted the thread. It felt like unhooking a chain from her ankle. No sound. No weight. Just release. She walked outside afterward, barefoot on the balcony, letting the breeze wrap itself around her. The city buzzed as it always did, generators humming, voices shouting over fuel prices, laughter from street kids skipping rope. Life had moved on. And this time, she was moving with it, not running, not hiding, just walking slowly back into herself. Pearl gave birth on a rainy Monday afternoon, the kind that flooded the streets and forced people to slow down. The hospital was quiet, nurses moving with the calmness that only comes with routine chaos. Josh held her hand the entire time, not saying much, but staying steady, his fingers interlocked with hers like a promise without words. When the baby came, red, loud, alive, Pearl wept, not from pain, but from the relief of knowing that something beautiful had survived the wreckage. They named him Zecora, which meant show the world. And he did. With every cry, every stretch of his tiny limbs, he reminded her that life could grow from broken places. She watched Josh cradle him later that evening, the soft light from the bedside lamp catching the tired pride in his eyes. He didn't say, "I forgive you," but he kissed her forehead gently, and in that touch was a kind of peace she hadn't dared hope for. Home didn't return all at once. It came in bits, in shared feeding schedules, in late-night diaper changes, in laughter that started to return without being forced. Pearl still had bad days, days where guilt sat beside her, whispering what-ifs. But those days grew fewer, and on the good days she wrote. She fed her child. She kissed her husband without flinching. There was no need to announce healing. It simply unfolded, one quiet choice at a time. And though the wound remained, it had scarred over cleanly. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest now. And sometimes honesty was more than enough. Sometimes life takes us through roads we never planned to walk. Loneliness, mistakes, regrets, they can pull us down paths where we lose ourselves. But no matter how far you've gone, you can always turn back to truth. Don't stay trapped in shame. Healing is possible. Forgiveness is hard, but not impossible. And when love is real, even if it breaks, it can still bend back into something new. Choose honesty. Choose growth. And never allow a single chapter to define the whole story of your life. May your heart never grow tired of hope. May your home be filled with peace that no storm can shake. May the love you give return to you, pressed down and overflowing. May your mistakes never bury you, but build you. May you find strength where others expect weakness. May truth be your covering, and grace be your path. May God surround you with real people who see you, value you, and walk with you through the fire. And when life tests you, may you come out refined, not ruined. In all you do, may mercy speak for you louder than judgment ever could. May your next season be better than your last. May your story end in joy, not shame. And may every listener to this story find their own kind of healing, in their own time, in their own way. If you believe this, let your heart whisper or shout, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.